It doesn't break you all at once. No, that would be too obvious. Instead, it arrives gently, like something you've been waiting for your entire life. A voice that feels familiar, a presence that feels like home, a connection that whispers, "This is it." And for a moment, you believe it. You lean in. You trust it. You start building something in your mind that feels real, solid, unshakable. But then something shifts. Not loudly, not enough for anyone else to notice. Just a quiet, persistent feeling that something isn't quite right. You begin to question things you never used to question. You replay conversations in your head, searching for meaning that should have been clear from the start. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You tell yourself this is what love must feel like: uncertain, intense, overwhelming. But deep down, there's a voice, a very quiet one, and it keeps asking a dangerous question. Why does something that's supposed to feel like home feel so heavy? You ignore it at first. Most people do, because walking away from something that feels like love is far more difficult than walking away from something that clearly isn't. And so you stay, you adjust, you convince yourself that confusion is normal, that doubt is part of the process, that maybe, just maybe, this is what love is supposed to feel like. But what if it isn't? What if the very thing you're holding on to, the thing you're protecting, defending, justifying, is not love at all? What if it only feels like it? It begins in a way that feels almost too perfect to question, not because everything is extraordinary, but because it feels familiar, comfortable, like something your heart recognizes before your mind has the chance to evaluate it. You don't see warning signs, you see alignment. You don't feel uncertainty, you feel intensity. And intensity can be very convincing. It has a way of disguising itself as depth, as meaning, as something rare and worth holding on to. At first, everything seems to flow effortlessly. The conversations stretch late into the night, filled with laughter, shared thoughts, and moments that feel significant. There's a rhythm that develops, a sense that you found someone who understands you without needing much explanation. And that feeling, that sense of being seen, is powerful. It can make you lower your guard, open your heart, and invest more of yourself than you ever planned to. But slowly, almost invisibly, something begins to shift. It's not dramatic. There are no obvious turning points, just small moments that don't quite sit right, a lack of consistency, a change in tone, a distance that can't be fully explained. You notice it, but you brush it aside. After all, nothing is perfect. Every connection has its ups and downs, right? So you adapt. You become more patient, more understanding, more willing to overlook what once would have made you pause. And this is where the illusion begins to take hold. Because what you're experiencing still feels like love. The emotional highs are still there. The attachment is still strong. The desire to make it work hasn't faded. In fact, it might even grow stronger because now there's something to fight for, something to fix, something to hold together. And that effort, that constant emotional investment, can trick you into believing that what you have is deeper than it really is. But love doesn't need to be constantly proven through struggle. Love, in its truest form, doesn't leave you in a state of quiet confusion. It doesn't make you question your value or your place in someone's life. It doesn't require you to shrink parts of yourself just to maintain harmony. Yet here you are doing exactly that, adjusting your expectations, softening your voice, convincing yourself that this is normal. And the most difficult part is that nothing feels clearly wrong. There's no single moment you can point to and say, this is where it broke. Instead, it's a gradual realization that something essential is missing. Not attention, not communication, but depth, the kind that brings clarity instead of confusion, peace instead of tension. What you're holding on to feels warm on the surface. It gives you just enough to stay, just enough to hope, just enough to believe that things will eventually align. But beneath that warmth, there's an absence, a quiet emptiness where certainty should be. And that's the illusion, because something can feel real without actually being real. It can mimic love so convincingly that you begin to doubt your own instincts. You start questioning whether your expectations are too high, whether you're asking for too much, whether the problem is you. But it isn't. The truth is, when something is genuine, it doesn't need to confuse you into staying. It doesn't rely on uncertainty to keep you attached. It stands clearly, honestly, without forcing you to interpret mixed signals or fill in emotional gaps on your own. And when you finally see that, the illusion begins to fade. There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of words, but from the absence of understanding. You can sit across from someone, exchange conversations, even share laughter, and still feel completely alone. On the surface, everything appears normal. Messages are sent, replies come back, time is spent together. But beneath all of that, there is a quiet distance that no amount of talking seems to close. At first, you don't recognize it for what it is. You assume it's temporary. Maybe they're tired. Maybe life is overwhelming them. Maybe you're expecting too much too soon. So you give it time, you give them space, you become patient in ways you've never been before. Because when something feels important, you don't want to lose it over something that might just need a little understanding. But time passes and the silence remains. Not the obvious kind, the kind where someone disappears or stops responding, but a deeper, more subtle silence, the kind where your thoughts go unacknowledged. Your emotions are heard, but not truly felt. You explain yourself carefully, clearly, hoping to be understood, and yet somehow the connection still feels incomplete. And so you try harder. You choose your words more carefully, you soften your tone, you replay conversations in your mind, wondering if you said something wrong, if you missed something, if you could have expressed yourself better. You begin to carry the responsibility of making the connection work as if it's something that depends entirely on your effort. But here's the truth that slowly begins to surface. When understanding is real, it doesn't require constant translation. You shouldn't have to explain the same feeling over and over again, hoping that this time it will land differently. You shouldn't feel like your inner world is a language the other person refuses to learn, because real connection isn't just about hearing words, it's about feeling their meaning, recognizing their weight, and responding with presence. Instead, what you find yourself facing is a kind of emotional disconnect that hides behind normal interactions. They respond, but not in the way that meets you. They listen, but not in a way that holds you. And over time, that gap, the space between what you express and what is truly received, starts to grow. It becomes exhausting, not because of conflict, but because of the lack of alignment. Because no matter how much you try to bridge the distance, it remains. And the hardest part is that there's no clear argument, no dramatic moment that forces you to confront it, just a lingering feeling that something essential is missing. You start to question yourself again. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you're expecting a level of understanding that isn't realistic. Maybe this is just how connections are. And so, once again, you adjust, you lower your expectations, you convince yourself that as long as there is communication, that should be enough. But deep down, you know it isn't. Because being heard is not the same as being understood. And being understood is not a luxury in love, it is a foundation. Without it, everything else begins to feel hollow, no matter how present it may seem on the outside. And that's when the realization quietly begins to take shape. You're not asking for too much. You're just not receiving what's real. There comes a point where staying no longer feels like loyalty. It feels like quiet self-abandonment, not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in small, almost invisible choices you make every day. You stay a little longer than you should. You accept a little less than you deserve. You silence parts of yourself just to keep the peace. And over time, those small compromises begin to add up, shaping a version of you that feels unfamiliar. At first, you tell yourself it's worth it. Every connection requires effort, right? Every bond asks for patience, understanding, sacrifice. So you lean into that belief. You become more flexible, more forgiving, more willing to overlook what once would have made you pause. You convince yourself that this is what commitment looks like, that staying, even when it's difficult, is a sign of strength. But there's a difference between commitment and quiet erosion. Because real connection doesn't slowly take pieces of you away. It doesn't ask you to shrink your needs just to maintain its existence. Yet here you are, adjusting in ways you never expected. You think twice before expressing how you feel. You measure your words carefully, afraid of being misunderstood or dismissed. You carry your emotions privately because sharing them no longer feels safe or worthwhile. And the cost of that is heavy. Not all at once, not in a way that shocks you into awareness, but gradually, like something slipping through your fingers, your energy starts to drain, your sense of clarity begins to fade. You feel tired, not physically, but emotionally. And the strangest part is you can't always explain why. There's no single moment, no clear reason you can point to, just a quiet exhaustion that lingers beneath everything. You start to notice how much effort it takes just to keep things feeling normal, how much of yourself you have to manage, adjust, or hold back. And still, something feels incomplete. The more you give, the less it seems to fill the space you're trying to repair. That's when a difficult truth begins to surface. Staying is no longer about love, it's about attachment, about the fear of letting go of something that once felt meaningful, about holding on to the idea of what it could be rather than accepting what it actually is. And that attachment can be powerful. It can convince you to endure far more than you should, simply because the thought of walking away feels heavier than the reality of staying. But the longer you remain in that space, the more it takes from you. Your peace becomes negotiable. Your boundaries become flexible. Your inner voice grows quieter, drowned out by the constant effort to make things work. And eventually, you find yourself in a place you never intended to be, holding on to something that no longer feels right simply because you've already invested so much into it. And that's the hidden cost. Not just the time you've spent, but the parts of yourself you've slowly set aside along the way. The version of you that once knew what felt right, what felt genuine, what felt whole, it's still there, but it's been pushed into the background, waiting for you to notice. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment where you begin to ask a different question. Not, how do I fix this? But, what is this costing me to keep? Confusion has a way of disguising itself as depth. It pulls you in, keeps you thinking, keeps you analyzing, convincing you that if something feels this complex, it must be meaningful. And so you stay engaged, trying to understand, trying to decode, trying to make sense of something that never quite settles into clarity. At first, it feels like intrigue. There's a certain intensity in not knowing, in wanting to figure someone out, in believing that there's something just beneath the surface waiting to be discovered. You tell yourself that maybe they're just guarded, maybe they express themselves differently, maybe it just takes time to fully understand each other. But over time, that intrigue begins to feel different. It becomes mental noise, a constant loop of questions without answers. You find yourself replaying moments, reading between lines that shouldn't need interpretation, searching for consistency that never quite arrives. What once felt interesting now feels exhausting, because clarity should not be something you have to chase. Yet somehow, you've been led to believe that this uncertainty is part of the connection. You begin to normalize it. You tell yourself that all relationships are complicated, that no one has everything figured out, that confusion is just a phase that will eventually pass. So you hold on. You wait for things to make sense. You convince yourself that if you're patient enough, if you understand enough, if you give enough, clarity will come. But it doesn't. Instead, the confusion lingers, and more than that, it deepens. You start to lose your sense of certainty, not just about the connection, but about yourself. You question your instincts, you doubt your reactions, you wonder if you're misreading things, overthinking, expecting too much. And that's where the real shift happens. Because confusion doesn't just affect how you see the other person, it begins to reshape how you see yourself. You become less grounded, less sure, less connected to your own inner clarity. You rely more on their actions, their words, their presence to determine how you feel. And when those things are inconsistent, your sense of stability becomes inconsistent too. But real connection doesn't do that. It doesn't blur your sense of self. It doesn't make you feel like you're constantly trying to find your footing. It doesn't leave you guessing where you stand or what something means. Real connection may have challenges, it may have moments of uncertainty, but at its core, it provides a sense of clarity, not confusion. And that's the difference that's so easy to overlook. Because confusion can feel intense, it can feel consuming, it can feel like something worth holding on to, simply because it occupies so much of your thoughts. But intensity is not the same as truth. And being consumed is not the same as being connected. At some point, you begin to notice how much energy it takes just to stay in that space, how much of your mental and emotional focus is tied up in trying to understand something that should feel natural. And slowly, a realization starts to form. Maybe the confusion isn't something to solve, maybe it's something to recognize. Because when something is real, truly real, it doesn't require you to lose yourself just to understand it. There is a moment, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when the truth finally settles in. Not loudly, not with confrontation or chaos, but with a kind of stillness that feels different from everything that came before. It's not confusion anymore. It's not overthinking, it's clarity. And clarity, when it finally arrives, doesn't argue with you. It simply shows you. You begin to see things as they are, not as you hoped they would be. The patterns you once ignored become impossible to overlook. The feelings you kept trying to explain away now stand clearly in front of you. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this: nothing has suddenly changed. It's all been there, quietly waiting for you to acknowledge it. For a while, you may resist it, because accepting the truth means letting go of the story you built around it. It means facing the reality that what you held on to so tightly, what you defended, justified, believed in, was never quite what you thought it was. And that realization can feel heavy, not because of what you're losing, but because of what you invested: time, energy, emotion, hope. You think about all the moments that felt real, all the times you convinced yourself to stay, all the ways you adjusted just to keep things intact. And for a brief moment, you may wonder if walking away makes all of that meaningless. But it doesn't, because every experience, even the ones built on illusion, still teaches you something real. And this one teaches you something powerful.